This week, the agenda examined Canadian involvement in the U.S. Civil War. We visited the geopolitical hotspots to watch in 2014, and we explored religious freedoms outside our borders. The agenda's Week in Review begins by adding up declining math achievement in Ontario students. The PISA math results. Here's graphic number 1. Shanghai, China tops the list. Quebec comes second. And then Finland. We've heard a lot about the Finnish educational miracle. Canada is next. And then as you get down into sub-jurisdictions, there's Ontario. And we're slipping down the list. We're now 13th out of 65 jurisdictions that were tested for math. The UK and the US coming in after that. How about the look at the past decade? And let's bring these scores up as well. The decline of provincial math scores over the past decade looks like this. As you look inside Canada, Alberta declines, Quebec about the same, Canada as a whole declining, Ontario declining, Manitoba declining, PEI declining over the last decade. This is of concern. Let's go around on this. John, what did you think when you saw these scores as they were released last month?
Well, I think we have to ask why they're slipping, but I think there's a deeper question. Even in the top countries, at least 30% of kids aren't doing very well, and very quickly moves to 50%. And that's been the case in Canada for years. We have to ask why even the best countries are teaching so little math to 30 to 50% of their population.
Annie, your view on this?
No, I think we have to look at it. I think the most important things to look at are ourselves compared to ourselves. So comparing ourselves to other countries, there are many factors that go in. I think John makes a good point that actually we need to look carefully then at who isn't doing well. But we've got to look in Ontario, even Ontario's own scores in the EQAO math tests have also gone down over the last about 5 years. So we need to look. I'm not sure I would ever go as far as calling it a national emergency, what some people called it.
The former Deputy Prime Minister called it that. John Manley
yes,
said it was a national emergency.
I don't think it's a national emergency, but I think it's something serious we need to look at. But I agree with John that what we need to do is look at who isn't successful, and then we need to try to understand why.
Clive, when you saw the numbers, your view?
As a parent, I've been concerned about, math education for a couple of years now. So the first thing I would say is that I'm not really very surprised, although I am very concerned. And I think looking forward, the way that our economy is developing, we have a very technologically driven economy, and math skills will be absolutely crucial for future generations. And this is of great concern. We need to make sure we have a solid foundation in math.
John, there is a body of thought out there that says these are PISA scores. It's one way of measuring things, but it's not the only way of measuring things, and it may not even be the best way of measuring things, and therefore take a Valium. What's your view on that?
That's a really complex question. It is a good measure, and in math it's pretty easy to measure some performance, but we also want to measure problem-solving deeper things, and also we want to measure, I think it's a great tragedy that kids don't love math. And I've seen kids cheer for math, beg to do math at recess. Kids are born with a sense of wonder, and they love solving puzzles and making connections, and they lose that through failure. So we also should be looking at what other losses are that come from not teaching math well.
Do you think these numbers, I guess on the question of before, the fact that they're going down, okay, but it's not the sum total or the only way to measure how well or badly we're doing in math. Therefore, it's not a national emergency, you've said, but
well, no, and I don't want to belittle that it's an issue. I think that it is a pretty good way of measuring how we're doing in math. I think what's really the other thing that's important is that it's not the only way of measuring how well our schools are doing.
Exactly.
That's very important, and we need to be careful. I mean, and one of the things we've been doing over the years is saying we have to be careful that we haven't kind of narrowed the definition of education by only looking at math and reading and writing. And I think that we have to, I think the thing that's always hard about these conversations is there's not one solution, there's not one problem, there's not one, quick silver bullet that we just need to change this. And the love of it is a really important piece. So as I was coming here, and I just talked to my daughter and said, I'm going to use you as an example. And she went, you always
Which
do.
daughter?
The younger daughter, who's the same age as John.
21.
She's 21. She's in university. She's taking advanced statistics. Grew up in an artsy-fartsy family where I thought, you know, and I want to take some of the blame for this as a kind of generation where it's like, I'm not a math person. This is part of what John talks about. So the assumption was, it's like, we don't like math. But Katie, in fact, loves math, and loves now doing advanced statistics, but she didn't take math in grade 12. She still doesn't know her times tables, but she has a deep understanding of mathematics. So we, again, you know, it's good to look at score, it's good to have data, and it's good to look at it for what you can use it for, but what's important is unpacking it and looking at it in all the complexity.
Is she going to speak to you again now that you've told all our viewers that
she
can't
said, don't say I can't do the times
tables? And you
did.
did.
And I said, so, what's 6 times 9? She went, oh, I don't know.
We know about a third of the 100,000 slaves that escaped after the war started ended up here, ended up in Canada. As a result, Canada passed something called the Fugitive Offenders Act. What was that?
Fugitive Offenders Act was trying to say what we could do with those ex-slaves once they had crossed the border and become free, living in what is now Ontario, a lot in the eastern townships of Quebec, and fewer living in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And the trick was that many in the United States saw this, especially in southern United States, saw us being a haven for those ex-slave as anathema because they were moving north and they were actually becoming successful. The first cab company in Toronto, for example, was formed by an ex-slave. And he ended up helping others, and a business community of ex-slaves grew in Toronto. Well, how could that be possible if the people in the South were trying to perpetrate the idea that these people, one, had no ambition and were subhuman and could not possibly be educated even if they were given the chance to be educated? And meanwhile, we were destroying their point of view. So the people in the South especially were fighting, trying to end the Underground Railroad by ending Canada as a terminus. So what we had to do was establish laws that said, yes, once they cross the border, they are free.
Who was John Anderson?
John Anderson was a fascinating man. He was a slave from Missouri who was one of those thousands who took the Underground Railroad, which was neither underground nor a railroad, but we know what we're talking about, and ended up in what became Ontario, southwestern Ontario. On his way out of Missouri, he ended up in a scuffle with a man, stabbed a man, who subsequently died. John Anderson didn't know that at the time, but he subsequently died. When he arrived in Canada, he did very well. He became a mason. He ended up getting his own business and was living a nice life as a free man. He did not know that the people of Missouri were still chasing him. When they came up, they wanted him extradited back to Canada, and therefore it went to court, and this was the decision that had to be made at the court in Osgoode Hall, just a few blocks from where we are. If the United States could extradite him back for murder, that means that the Underground Railroad was dead, because they could pick up ex-slaves in Toronto like they pick them up in Boston. If the Canadian court said no, that moving forward out of the North or the South and into Canada meant that no matter what you did to escape slavery, it was justified, even murder, then the Underground Railroad would not only continue, it would flourish. So it became an international case. People from Britain were watching, people from the United States were watching, and whatever decision that court made, it was going to determine the future of not only the Underground Railroad, but of the South.
And what was the verdict?
And the verdict was, you can't have him, we're keeping him.
Let me talk about Lincoln's murder with you.
Yes.
And again, one of the things that is absolutely new to me in this book is that Abraham Lincoln's assassination, the plot was hatched in Montreal. Tell us about that. I didn't know that.
Montreal was a hotbed of Confederate activity, as was Toronto, St. Catharines, Niagara Falls, Windsor. There were a number of Confederate agents that were here throughout the war. And in 1863, for the reasons that I talked about, that it looked like the South was going to lose, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, said, what we need to do is have one more option, one more way to fight this war that he recognized that he was losing. So he asked a man who was named Jacob Thompson, who was a former federal cabinet minister in the ministry just before Lincoln's, and a Mississippi politician, to go north, go to Toronto, and establish a spy ring in Toronto, in Montreal. And he did that. And from Toronto, the Queen's Hotel, where the Royal York now sits, was the center of Confederate activity in what is this part of Canada. And the St. Lawrence Hall, not Toronto's St. Lawrence Hall, but the Montreal St. Lawrence Hall, which was a swanky hotel, they bragged about having the best mint juleps in all of Montreal. All the Confederates were there. And so when John Wilkes Booth, the actor who was from Baltimore and in Washington area, his mail, he picked up the mail at the theater where he eventually shot Lincoln. When he needed to put together a plot for first the kidnapping of Lincoln, and then it turned into the assassination of Lincoln, he needed to be where he could get the money that he needed and the contacts that he needed. So he went north to Montreal, and he talked to the people that were in Montreal, and he was there for about a week. He went to the Bank of Ontario that was there at the time, and that's where the money changed hands that was used in order to put together the conspiracy, and back down they came. And when the assassination happened and the trial happened afterwards, the very first questions of the very first witnesses in that trial were about Montreal and Canada. They were trying to link Canada to the assassinations, because it was happening after too, that we could then link the assassinations and attack Canada.
In the same way that a lot of people in Dallas felt a lot of guilt over the killing of President John F. Kennedy, could you tell whether there was a considerable amount of guilt in Montreal over the killing of Abraham Lincoln?
I don't know whether it was guilt, but there certainly was denial.
As a Catholic, I assume you'd have to be against same-sex marriage. But then there would be potentially religious gays somewhere in the world who may be persecuted because they are attempting to get married. That might put in conflict your personal religious views with your public service responsibilities. How would you handle that?
Well, here's where we get into the question of how I think different rights interlink. Freedom of religion does not exist in and of itself. It has to dovetail with other fundamental freedoms. You know, I have my own personal views on issues such as same-sex marriage.
Did I accurately characterize it?
I'm a Catholic. I'm a faithful Catholic.
Enough said.
But, you know, it's important, I think, to recognize that any people who are unjustly persecuted, we need to speak out for them. We need to defend them. So whether we're speaking about, you know, people who are homosexual in a country such as Uganda, and the government's been very active on this. Minister Baird has spoken out on that particular case. Whether we're speaking about young girls who are being forced into marriages in certain parts of the world, whether we're speaking about Christians being persecuted, at the core, it's a question of human dignity. And freedom of religion is fundamentally, Steve, not a theological issue, it's a human issue. And when we get right down to it, it's about recognizing that every human being has the inherent right and dignity to be able to consider, who am I? Who am I in relationship to others? Who am I in relationship to this world we all live in? Who am I in relationship to God or to a particular philosophy I may choose to support? So human dignity must be at the crux of that. And as a Catholic, the church and Christians generally have always had an emphasis on the dignity of the human person. And that informs very much my work.
Okay. Can we talk some politics here in our last few minutes? You can't say no. You're stuck here. Here's the thing. It is unusual in this country for the government to legislate in the area of religion. And when the Harper government did this a couple of years ago, it did catch some people found it very noteworthy, very newsworthy. Here's what Jeffrey Simpson wrote in the Globe and Mail almost a year ago. He wrote, "The Harper conservatives' latest brainchild, an ambassador for religious freedom, is supposed to criticize other countries' lack of protection for religious minorities. These critiques will have zero effect on the intended targets, but they will be wildly popular with domestic religious groups who are the real political targets. You can be sure that the announcements from this new ambassador will feature prominently in the church groups in Canada that are the Post's principal targets, to say nothing of Conservative MPs' household mailings in ridings where religiosity counts. It is guaranteed that the ambassador's various pronouncements will receive far more attention in these selected slices of Canada than in any of the countries targeted by him or the government. Let's get into this. How do you respond to that?
I would disagree with Mr. Simpson. You know, I think obviously there are those people of faith, whether they're Christians, whether they're Jews, whether they're Muslims in Canada, who are very supportive of our office, and I'm grateful for that. But we also have, I think, the office is supported within Ottawa. I took a step very early on with Minister Baird's permission to engage the different party caucuses in Parliament. Parliamentarians have a fundamental role in our society for upholding our values, upholding our freedoms. I've received, positive feedback from them, from the different parties, and fundamentally, this is about human rights. And I think
that's not what he's getting at. He's saying fundamentally this is about domestic politics.
Well, I would disagree with him. And if I can use a couple of examples, it has had some effect. I think to say zero effect is a bit overstating it. We had a situation where a prominent Muslim human rights activist in Sri Lanka was arrested by the Sri Lankan authorities, ostensibly under their sort of Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is sort of a catch-all for all sorts of spurious investigations and arrests. Azath Saleh is his name. He was arrested and was held, and was not really being given full access to his legal rights. And he had been a very outspoken critic of the government and a defender of the Muslim minority in Sri Lanka. I issued a statement under our office condemning his arrest, condemning the treatment that he was being afforded while being held. We spoke with the Sri Lankan ambassador to Canada, the High Commissioner to Canada, raising our concern about this, raising our concern about how different religious minorities are treated in that country. Mr. Saleh was subsequently released several weeks after. His first stop after his release was to the Canadian High Commission in Colombo to thank Canada for speaking out.
So it had an impact.
It has an impact.
The Koreans have problems with China, but the Koreans also remember all the problems they had with the Japanese, the fact that they have never had an apology that they consider worthwhile from the Japanese over comfort women, over the way the Korean minority even today is treated in Japan. There are all kinds of competing influences in Asia, but the biggest one, China wants more space. It wants more space for trade. It views the South China Sea as a Pacific lake, or that it should be a Pacific lake that belongs to them. And of course, the Americans don't want this. Malaysia doesn't want it. Vietnam doesn't want it. Japan doesn't want it. South Korea doesn't want it. The Philippines don't want it. The key for America is to try to get these disparate allies to get together themselves. And it's a real challenge for the United States because the Koreans and Japanese dislike each other so much that it's hard to forge a common cause against China. But it will come, and I think eventually Russia will join it too because of Chinese economic activity in the Russian Far East. There's a tremendous amount going on in Asia. When you talk about trends, we still get excited by some of the things that happen in the Middle East, and we should be because bad things happen. But China the whole game is being played in Asia. I spoke last year with you a bit about that. The shift is inexorable, and we make a mistake if we ignore it too much, and also if we just want to do trade with China because there will be so many other issues. Canada will be participating in huge war games this summer in the Pacific Ocean off Hawaii that China will regard as a provocation. Well, that's our little part of the puzzle, even though the Chinese have been invited to those war games.
Let me ask you about something China's doing on the domestic front, and you tell us how you think that will have an impact on the international stage. They have relaxed their one child per family policy, which has been around for a very long time, decades, and they've made some changes to their welfare system. How could that have an influence on what they're attempting to do internationally?
Well, I think if they had made economic reform, serious economic reform, it would have a bigger effect. I think the one-child policy is purely domestic, and it will help them with the population because there's no policy that the Chinese people felt more strongly about and opposed than this one-child policy, even if they didn't want more than one child. It's tough if somebody says you can't do it. you don't like it. And that was a real problem with that. As for China and the rest of it, and its international ambitions, it will be about what China does, I think, overwhelmingly with its military and how it uses its economy and trade. And already we see in some of the trade deals in Asia that China is a bully. I went to the APEC meeting in, where was it this year? Indonesia. But I was in Malaysia a couple of days before when Stephen Harper went there to visit. And it was a complete Chinese show. Poor Stephen Harper arrived in a country that was bathed in Chinese flags because, like Canada, the Malaysians want all this huge money from China. And even though, while Harper was there, they signed a huge and important trade deal, a gas deal. It got lost. It got a couple of paragraphs in the newspapers because the focus of the media and the public there, as it is everywhere in Asia, is on China. And everybody, it's the same problem Canada has. Everybody wants to do business with China, but at the same time they want to rein China in and don't want China to tell them what to do, and they don't want Chinese warships going around. It's interesting, in the last few days, the Chinese icebreaker is involved down in Antarctica. That's the very same icebreaker that unannounced entered Canadian waters a couple of years ago in the Arctic Ocean. And China thinks it has a big role to play in the Arctic Ocean. China's tentacles are everywhere. The business deals they are making in Africa
too, yes.
Africa, it's huge what they're doing there. They're rebuilding the British colonial railway system for all of Africa, spending tens of billions of dollars just on that. And then closer to home, what they're doing in countries like Laos, they're going to own that country lock, stock, and barrel. Lock, stock, and barrel. And the United States and others are trying to get in. It's the same story in Burma, where Canada hopes to get somewhere. But if you go to the northern half of Burma, it's awash with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of illegal Chinese immigrants, as is Eastern Russia. China is on the march in so many ways, in so many different places, and it bears watching.
The province of Ontario doesn't make monetary policy. It can't mess around with exchange rates or anything like that. It has to live by them. So as you look, Avery, for the year ahead in the province of Ontario, and I guess we'll have having a federal budget next month that will have an impact on Ontario, and then a provincial budget shortly thereafter, which may beget an election, who knows. What are you seeing in this province as an economic outlook?
Well, I'm not seeing the kind of things that would want me to be in the chair of the finance minister and actually have to deliver that budget. We will probably grow a little bit slower than the national average because
is that a 1 or a 2?
Well, I think it'll be a 2, but it'll be a decimal place or 2 below the national average. It might be about 2% growth, which is, it's okay. And the problem is, of course, the province is still wrestling with a pretty big debt that it ran up during weak economic times when it tried to stimulate appropriately. It's trying to winnow that down. And 2% economic growth does not give you a lot of revenue coming in your pocket that gives you room to really do a lot. So this is an environment in which the province has to, I think, be nimble in terms of trying to attract investment. It's been talking to Ford and Chrysler and so on, trying to make sure that it's competitive with offers being dangled in front of those car companies, for example, in the US South. I think that's appropriate. It's trying to maintain, certainly not raise taxes to slow the growth further. But it doesn't have a lot of elbow room. I suspect that the budget, for example, is going to be, a pretty short budget in the sense of not a lot of items, because they don't have a lot of obvious initiatives that they can afford right now to drive growth.
Having said that, Don, I can recall former Liberal Finance Minister Greg Sorbera saying, people like you always underestimate the ability of the Ontario economy to perform and deliver more revenue to the Treasury than the officials, for example, in his ministry expected to happen. Is that true?
There's a lot to that. I think as far as Ontario is concerned, I'm probably a little less pessimistic about Ontario's position vis-a-vis the rest of the country as a result of the changes that have been taking place. I think the depreciation of the Canadian dollar, the recent depreciation of the Canadian dollar, the prospects for economic growth in the United States play more into Ontario than to the rest of the country because of the importance of our auto sector, for example. And we do have about 45% of all the manufacturing in the country. And I think once the wheels start turning in the sectors that are sensitive to U.S. growth and a lower Canadian dollar, I think that will play into to Ontario's hands relative to, say, Alberta, where energy prospect, those energy commodities have been in the doldrums of late, and that again is an American story because of the expansion of energy production in the United States. So it's not a horse race. It shouldn't be presented that way anyway, but I do think that some of the fundamentals are shifting in favor of Ontario, and so I wouldn't necessarily put the projection of Ontario's performance a decimal point below the national average. I'd put it a decimal point above.
A decimal point above. Mm-hmm. So you two are disagreeing to the extent of 0.2 of a percentage
The one
point.
thing I'd say about Ontario is that we've also had the brunt of the condo boom. And as we start to sell fewer of them, which is happening now, we will be building fewer of them. So Ontario's challenge is actually to replace a lot of growth that we got in sectors like construction with growth in something else. If you look at the last year, it's interesting, the U.S. auto sales have surged. North American auto sales, in fact, have done fantastically. If you actually look at what has happened to auto assemblies in Canada, they're down year over year. Remember all those plant closure announcements a couple of years ago? Well, the plants have been closing. And so the plants that are remaining, yes, they're producing more, but once you take away the ones that are closing, actually, it's been very disappointing. So we will get some leverage in Ontario from a better U.S. economy. But in terms of the normal linkage, that linkage, it's not broken, but it's not nearly as powerful as it had been.
Okay, I want to spend our remaining 5 or 6 minutes here talking about an announcement of significance that Tim Hudak, the Ontario Conservative leader, made earlier this week, in which he came out with a 5-point plan saying, if you elect me and if I can do these things, this province is going to get 1 million private sector jobs over the next 8 years. And briefly, reduce debt and taxes, encouraging more young people to train for skilled trades, increase trade with other provinces through new interprovincial free trade agreements, make better use of federal immigration programs, matching immigrants to jobs, reduce regulatory red tape by 1/3 over 3 years. Here's a question. How realistic is it in this day and age, Aaron first, for any politician to put forward a platform in which he says, do this and we'll create 1 million jobs?
Well, if Tim Hudak were here, I'm sure he'd hasten to point out that Ontario employment did increase by 1 million during the 8 years of Mike Harris and Ernie Eves. I guess the real question, though, is why did that happen? I think it happened largely because you had a red-hot American economy as well as a Canadian dollar fall into 62 U.S. cents. So it's a good time to be a branch plant of the United States. I do think, though, it's almost ridiculous to suggest that any given set of policies could be relied upon to create 1 million jobs. And it reminds me a little bit of what the American governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, did. He promised to create 250,000 jobs in 4 years, and actually has not even created half that many. Wisconsin actually lags other American states in terms of job creation. So I really do see this as a page taken out of the U.S. Republican playbook. And I mean, for what it's worth, I actually think the policies Hudak is proposing would reduce employment.
Don.
I'll take 2 points from the Hudak agenda. First, with respect to the corporate tax and the impact of a point reduction in that to attract new investment. I don't think that that's what would really drive investment. I would think economic expansion generally would be what would drive investment. The one point that I really like about Hudak's proposal is his emphasis on training. Because the more flexible is your labor force when the structure of your economy is changing, the more your labor force can play into the growth prospects that are there. And so I like that, and there were some suggestions too of encouraging innovation by enhancing flexibility within industry and removing barriers between provinces. Now that tends to be a national debate as opposed to a provincial debate, and if any Ontario premier, whether it's with the Liberals or the PCs, was to drive that agenda, I think that would be a smart thing to do. So he's hinting at it, and I think it's wise.
Promising 1 million jobs over 8 years?
Well, 8-year forecasts are meant to be broken one way or the other. We don't even forecast beyond 2 years in our own shop, so I think it is always difficult to project out that far. I think that some of these are pretty uncontroversial, actually. I would say, for example, that we don't do the best job matching the education system with the demands of the labor market. We somehow have an Ontario government, for example, that runs the education system by and large, graduates more teachers than the education system that hires teachers actually needs. So we don't actually do a good job making the size of those programs match the demand, even when government is involved on both the education and the hiring. And I think the same thing is somewhat true with immigration, although there's a lot of federal responsibility there. We've improved a bit, but I think there's more to do to matching the immigrants, bringing the right kinds of immigrants in. Whether a corporate income tax cut will be valuable, I mean, any economic model will show you that a corporate income tax cut will help growth. The one caveat is that if you're aiming at a specific budget deficit target, if you cut someone's taxes, whose are you raising and how much do you lose? So, or whose paycheck are you reducing by cutting government spending by the equivalent amount? So I haven't seen the math. Obviously, the Conservatives will release more details on this, and economists and voters will be in a position to analyze it better when we see all of it.
We should also remember that Ontario did just cut its corporate tax rate from 14 to 11.5%, and while that certainly has boosted after-tax corporate profits, there's very little evidence that it's actually improved investment or employment. I mean, we were just talking about how companies failed to take advantage of the high exchange rate to buy more machinery and equipment. Well, the other thing they failed to take advantage of was all these additional after-tax profits. They didn't use them to buy machinery and equipment either. So I'm very much unconvinced that further across the board corporate tax cuts are the solution. What I would like to see is much more targeted incentives where we say we'll give companies an investment tax credit if they actually make investments in Ontario or in Canada. Either companies would invest and make use of those incentives, or the government would be able to collect more revenue by reversing the corporate tax rate reductions and invest more money in public infrastructure.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website. That's theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.